Welcome to this second lecture of week 3, module 3 about political institutions. This one is going to be a bit shorter because we're really only focused on one topic. So in this mini lecture, I want to just provide some additional context about what we know with respect to legislatures and parties and autocracies. So here's the thing that we know from a lot of comparative politics research is that autocracies or authoritarian regimes or dictatorships or non-democracies, we can generally use those terms interchangeably. The ones that hold elections tend to last longer than those that don't. And by last longer, what I mean is that leaders who run these autocracies that have elections stay in office for longer. So this is from a great book from an Oxford University Press series called What Everyone Needs to Know. And in this case, this is about autocracy. So this is authoritarianism, what everyone needs to know. And you can look at here, this is the median years in power, so regime survival. So if we were to, for example, like split these countries or like rank them in order, this would be like the 50th percentile, so like the middle amount of years that leaders stay in power, to try to get a more accurate read, because means sometimes can be skewed based on if you have like really high or really low observations. So this is just like the median years that leaders are in power. And then here in the green, this other line, this is the percentage of regimes that have authoritarian elections, right? So they have elections, they have legislatures, they have parties. And the two tend to track, and we do see that as regular elections become more common, regimes tend to become more durable as well. So how do these seemingly institutions of democracy, right? We normally associate legislatures and political parties with democracy. How do these institutions of democracy actually allow leaders in dictatorships to stay in charge as opposed to like leading to democratization? Well, basically, in a nutshell, leaders of autocracies use legislatures and parties to eliminate and prevent and mitigate threats to their rule from within both elites and the broader society. So these are basically tools, these are institutions that are used to allow leaders to stay in charge by making sure that any opposition they're able to co-opt, to eliminate. So how do these elections and legislatures work? Well, one way is by signaling the regime's strength. So if you have elections where people go out to vote and they're not going to be coerced, and yes, maybe they're getting some material incentives for voting, maybe you're giving them subsidies, or maybe something is required of them, like they have to vote to get some like government benefit, but irrespective, right? They're going out, they're voting, you get, you win elections with like 90 or 80% of the vote. Well, that can signal to the opposition that the regime is relatively strong, and relatively popular. And so if you're in the opposition and you see that the government just won elections, yes, they're not free and fair, but they just won elections with, say, like 80% of the vote, who is going to be out there to support your attempt to overthrow the regime? Maybe not that many people, potentially. So dictators allow these legislatures and parties to exist, especially if they have like one main party, because it signals their strength and it deters the opposition from organizing. There's a link here to a fabulous book by Beatrice Magaloni about this phenomenon happening in Mexico specifically, but it is a phenomenon that applies to all autocrats. You can use your legislature to acquire information about people who live in your country and to try to ward off any kind of potential opposition. So this is another link to a paper that was published in 2011, maybe I want to say, about the legislature in Vietnam. And so these political scientists had looked at the legislature in Vietnam and what having elections and having a legislature does for the Vietnamese government is it allows them to collect information from these members of Congress who represent their constituents across the entire country. And those members of parliament can bring their constituents' complaints to the legislature, and those who are in charge, like the party who's in charge, can hear them and can try to address them in some way, right? So obviously, if there's complaints about there being no freedom and no free elections, the regime's not going to address those. But if it's things like, oh, this province or this area is not getting enough resources, right? We need to build more roads, like the schooling system needs to improve. There need to be more job opportunities. That's information that the leaders of a dictatorship can take and then address those grievances so that people are generally happy with their economic conditions or where they're living, and then you don't have a big uprising, right? So it's a way of getting information. This is especially the case in the Middle East. Legislatures and parties can also be used to distribute patronage. So I talked about in the previous lecture about how regimes use repression and co-optation and legitimation, like how dictatorships use those to stay in charge. Well, let's say you want to buy off everybody. You want to buy off the opposition, right? You want to co-opt them. Having a legislature is actually a pretty effective way of doing it because you have one forum where a lot of people are coming together on a regular basis, and you can distribute those resources to people, right? You can buy off elites. You can have those elites pass along, good government contracts to their voters or pass along perks to their voters. So it's kind of like a vehicle for being able to distribute patronage. Ellen Lust is a political scientist who now I want to say is at Cornell potentially, but she has written a lot about the Middle East, and she's written a lot about how elections in the Middle East are especially about distributing patronage. And then finally, you can also use legislatures and parties to credibly commit to elites that there is going to be some path for them to advance in your political party so they don't decide to all gang up against you and stage a coup. So yes, leaders do need to fear, like leaders in autocracies do have to fear, like what happens with the mass public, but oftentimes people are not going to uprise, like you don't know if your neighbor's going to do it, like are you going to do it, what if you get repressed, maybe you're willing to sit it out. So a lot of threats often come from fellow elites who do have more access to you and who do have more access to resources. So if you have a legislature and you have a political party and people can move up in the ranks of the political party, well, then they don't have an incentive to overthrow you and your regime because they know that eventually maybe their day will come, which was the case in this example with China. And that is it for this much shorter lecture, this time about political institutions in autocracies.